Alrighty everyone, acoustic engineering has been completed. We can now pass to electrical engineering, hosted by a mechanical engineer. Okay, so welcome everyone. I'm Wilf Johnston, Vice Chair at SEN, and I will be the MC. This is a deepish dive into one aspect of the question, can renewables run the WA grid, and what we can learn from the Iberian Blackout. Now, while the talk will focus on some of the technical aspects, there's also wider lessons to be learnt on the politics, social science, misinformation, disinformation, circulating long after the event itself. I'm sure there's plenty of us involved in this space that are frustrated that this is still a topic. Hence, we thought it would be really good to kind of get together and nut out some of the finer talking points and learnings and all have a better way of communicating what's come out of the event. Now, quick practicalities, emergency response. In the likely event of an emergency, if you need to evacuate, follow the whoop whoop sound. Please follow the direction of security, and fire exits are the rear and front of the auditorium. There. Designated assembly area is to the right as you leave the building. Now, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we are meeting on, the Whadjuk people. We recognise the Whadjuk people's connection to country as we come together to talk about ways that we can address the climate crisis that significantly impacts country. We recognise elders past and present, and we recognise that sovereignty was never ceded. Now, a quick advertorial for SEN. It's been a super productive year for us. We've had, up to this event, we've had 770 attendees to our events this year, which is fantastic. And 25% increase in numbers and a 50% increase in people on LinkedIn chasing after us and telling us that we don't know what we're talking about. Most of them are after Fraser. Now, we've also got a new committee in place for 2026. So I know some of those people were able to attend today, so I don't know if they were able to stand up. We've got Aria and Zara and Paul, and not sure whether Peter's around. But just a quick round of applause for those guys and for Fraser. Oh, cheers. Now, we're a 100% volunteer-based organisation, so our volunteers are super important. If anyone here wants to help out, has a little bit of time to spare, please let us know. There's always interesting projects that need a bit of manpower. So first up, I'd like to introduce Fraser. So as you would know, the normal host of these events, he thought introducing himself was probably pushing it a bit far, so asked me to do it. Fraser tells me he graduated in 1981 in electrical and electronic engineering from Robert Gordon's Institute of Technology. It sounds like a very Scottish institution, so that's right, in Aberdeen, and has forgotten anything he may have learnt last century. So that's good, because it's been 26 years since then. So please welcome Fraser to the lectern for a bit of a primer talk and a bit of background on the grid.
Great. Great, thanks Wilf, thanks for that. So this primer, let's get the slide up. So this primer is designed for the general public and who are interested in the energy transition, but perhaps a little bit uncertain to the limits of what renewables can actually do in a larger grid. So it's a primer for Carlos's presentation, so people have a basic understanding so they can follow the story about what happened in Iberia. So the presentation will be available on the SEN website. This is the full presentation. I had more slides, but my daughter said that's too many. So I had to cut a whole bunch of slides out. So the full presentation will be on the site. So, but it's not intended to be a comprehensive or address all aspects of the energy transition. So thanks to Craig Carter. I saw Craig earlier on. Thanks, Craig, who helped out reviews an earlier copy of the presentation. But Craig, all mistakes are mine and mine alone. So let's look at Electricity Grids 101. So poles and wires, how hard can it be? So universal energy objectives, it doesn't matter where you are in the world, are supply security, affordability, and environmental impacts. Now the WA state electricity objectives expand on these to provide greater guidance and introduce a capital efficiency test on reliability. So that's not unusual, but that's what we're trying to achieve. As you probably know, in WA, we have two main grids. We have the Northwest Interconnected System and the Southwest Interconnected System. Those two systems aren't interconnected, nor are we connected to the East Coast network. And that includes the potential access to the East Coast long-duration energy storage. So, due to the distances, costs, and benefits, there is no strong business case for interconnecting either the SWIS or the NUIS, or nor the SWIS or the national electricity market. It comes up every few years, why don't we interconnect it and everything else, but there is no strong business case. And we also have multiple microgrids across the state. So most are islanded, which means they're not connected to the grid, but some can be connected and disconnected to the grid to improve reliability. So, forecasting demand, so security of supply. Do we have enough energy now and into the future? And what does the energy mix need to look like to ensure we don't, what we have, the industry calls unserved energy, which is an interesting turn of phrase. So Energy Policy WA and the Australian Energy Market Operator both produce forecasts to help shape government policy, public and private investment. Now, forecasts are always wrong, and the trick is to forecast frequently. So demand forecasting and energy supply are part of energy modelling, which takes into account a large range of factors, including the nature of weather variable renewable energy. So modelling by SEN, AEMO, and EPWA, and others all highlight like flexible, dispatchable generation is required with sufficient reserve capacity and short-term and long-duration energy storage. One area that's not fully reflected in energy models is the generation, storage, and supply of industrial heat as we start to decarbonise industry via electrification. So implicit in making models work in practice are things like weather forecasting, demand management, supply, energy efficiency, storage, advanced technologies like AI that smooth and firm variable renewable energy. As a past energy minister I'd like to remind us, there's no transition without transmission. What he was a little bit slower on was the planning and funding of that sufficient transmission. So here in WA, we're currently in a bit of a race to find out if we can build sufficient transmission and replacement generation to enable timely coal closure. So let's have a look at some of the modelling that we have done. This is a model that SEN's generated and demonstrates what can be achieved at certain times of the grid where all the energy can be served by wind, solar and batteries with gas backup. And this is a typical, an actual day recently, and the SWIS continues to break the records in terms of renewable energy contribution. And the most recent here was 30th of November, where renewable energy supplied 100% demand. So this is what can be achieved. But obviously, skeptics like to point out that the wind doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow. That's not really news to us, to be honest. And whilst batteries significantly extend the range of solar, it does serve to highlight that energy planning needs to consider inter-seasonal, inter-annual, and inter-decadal forecasts, weather forecasts, so demand can be met at all times, and not just on average. So this diagram from SEN's modelling shows the impact of a wind drought combined with low solar output during the course of an overall week. And as you can see, we're relying quite heavily on gas. So the key takeaway from this, and it's a commercial and technical challenge, is that large-scale renewables requires large-scale backup. That's kind of unavoidable. Right, so what are grids? These are the main building blocks of a grid. So you've got generation, transmission, and load. And load consists of large industrial loads and multiple commercial and residential appliances consuming energy. Those power transformers, they step up the voltage to make transmission more efficient and step it down to be used in the distribution network and for connecting large industrial loads. Those circuit breakers I show there are designed to interrupt the flow of electricity either as normal switching or as protection when breakers trip to isolate faults. So let's go on to one of the main challenges on managing a grid is managing a stable frequency as load and generation fluctuate, because you're dealing with a dynamic environment. Interesting thing about electricity is the amount of supply must always match the amount of demand at all times. So the system always has to be in balance, unlike a gas system where you can draw energy out, you can do a bit of gas banking. So an excess, in this diagram, an excess of supply represents more weight on the supply end of the balance, which tips the seesaw in the direction of increased system frequency. And conversely, if there's an undersupply or demand increases, then frequency will fall. So power systems need inertia to provide time to respond to supply-demand changes. And armchair experts were quick to point out the Iberian blackout was caused by insufficient inertia in the system due to too much renewables. And the actual story is more complicated and nuanced, as Carlos will explain in his presentation. Inverter-based resources like wind solar batteries can produce synthetic inertia using power electronics and control algorithms to inject or absorb power during a disturbance to help stabilize system frequency. One phenomena, which I think Carlos is going to talk about, is low-frequency oscillations. They're actually a feature of the grid caused by faults or imbalances between supply and demand. And grid designs include means to dampen those oscillations using power system stabilizers. But undamped oscillations can become sustained and grow and threaten the stability of a power system and can lead and have led to blackouts in the past. So quickly looking at how we protect the grid. So they're very dynamic environments and have to be robust to manage a large operating envelope. Faults can arise from a number of different sources, as noted on the slide. So what we need to do is to be able to quickly and effectively distinguish between normal operations, including operating at the upper limits of equipment rated capacity, and fault conditions. And this is the job of protection relays, that they need to be quick, accurate, reliable, selective, and stable throughout their operating envelope. One particular signature of a fault is high fault current, right, which traditionally large thermal generators can produce. I mean, there are other ways of detecting fault conditions, such as distance relays and differential current, etc. And inverter-based resources like wind solar batteries produce lower fault currents, but can be programmed to detect and respond to faults. So grids need to be able to operate during fault conditions by isolating faults and not have a fault propagate through the system. So inverter-based resources can be programmed to have what's called fault ride-through, and that's a very important feature that provides robustness and avoids similar equipment responding inappropriately to a fault, and then you have an avalanche of trips under what's called a common mode failure scenario. This is a picture of a particular piece of equipment called a synchronous condenser, if you've ever wondered what they look like. And they emulate large generators by producing fault current, inertia, and voltage support. They're like large electric motors, they don't burn fuel, and they can be used in larger grids with high contribution from inverter-based resources. They're being used in South Australia and elsewhere. Right, so let's look at voltage stability. That's another aspect of it. And you've probably heard the term, you may have heard the term called electrical system strength, which is a bit of a catch-all term for a combination of physical parameters that describe how well a power system can maintain voltage and frequency following a disturbance. So wind and solar farms, or any other generation for that matter, can't always be connected to strong parts of the grid due to suitable physical locations, land use, environmental approvals, network constraints, etc. And long transmission lines can lead to weaker grids. Luckily, grids can be strengthened by introducing additional equipment such as battery energy storage, sync-ons, static compensators, and also by using inverter-based resources as grid forming. So voltage stability is very dynamic, and the system response changes under various conditions such as disturbances, load variations, and equipment failures. Now, key point about voltage stability, unlike frequency control, it's actually needed locally. So it's got to be done locally, and this involves generating and absorbing what's called reactive power. Quickly on a piece of technology, you may have heard about grid following and grid forming inverters. So grid following inverters, as you can probably imagine, they synchronize with the grid and they inject current into an existing grid. They are unable to operate independently when disconnected from the grid in an islanded mode, but in your household, a battery and a hybrid inverter can still operate to power your house if the grid does drop out. Grid forming inverters, by contrast, they actually create their own voltage and frequency to help control the grid, enabling islanded operation, black start capability, and increased stability. They can't be used universally, unfortunately, because in some parts of the grid, the grids can be called what's called stiff, which has got high strength that resists changes in voltage and current, voltage and frequency, I should say. But modern inverters are capable of switching between those two modes. Right, getting towards the end, you'll be pleased to know. So summary, Security affordability is done through demand forecasting and modeling in context and leads to insights on the required energy mix. So you can have an opinion, but unless it's informed by modeling, then it's probably not worth a great deal. And this modeling leads to ensure the sufficient generation, storage, and auxiliary resources in the system with adequate monitoring, control, and protection systems. There's also a need for a plan, funding, and resources for the energy transition, and there needs to be competent resources dedicated to keeping those large, complex systems operating correctly, and also to manage the energy transition. And I'm not sure if anybody that grew up in the 70s would have seen this was a staple diet of spinning plates, and this is what the grid is a little bit like. Is things are always changing, and you've got to be constant attention to detail. So that's the primer for Carlos's presentation, which is over you, Carlos.
There you go. So that's like a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering in 15 minutes. So, next up, I'd like to introduce Carlos Gamez. So I've got to credit Carlos with coming up with the idea for this session and talking with us about what he could contribute on this front a bit earlier in the year. So thank you, Carlos. Carlos founded Nova Energy Consulting in 2022 and brings more than 27 years' experience across the energy, asset management and digitalisation sectors. He served as head of asset performance at Western Power, seems pretty appropriate for today, and was instrumental in the enablement of the transformation of the grid whilst meeting the objectives of the in-service network. As a published author, Carlos has contributed ideas that help shape the future of the electrical energy industry. Please welcome Carlos to the lectern to discuss the root causes behind the Iberian Blackout and lessons we can learn. Yes.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to SEN for the invitation and fellow panelists, and for you guys to spend some time this afternoon. I guess the question that we're trying to answer, right? Can renewables run the WA grid? And we're going to bring the Iberian Blackout into context to see if there's any lessons that we can learn from that. It's probably the most recent event of that size in the world, probably one of the largest, to be honest, but certainly not the only one, and obviously it's not going to be the last. I hope WA is not next. I would like to start with an analogy, just to set the scene on what we are going to review about the Spain's blackout. So let's try to imagine the electrical network, or compare the electrical network with a mechanical system. Think of the generators of the network as trucks, pulling a load. The loads are your houses, the industry, motors, the air cons, all that sort of stuff. So all of them represent these trailers. There is a wide range of size of them. You get all sorts of generators, all kinds of different sizes and types and ways of doing their job, and some are gas and some are coal, and now we have renewables feeding from the sun and the wind. And also trailers, there's all kinds of sizes and behaviors on how these things operate. So what we do is, you can think of the grid as a big steel beam, very rigid, connecting all the trailers, all the tractors in the network to all the trailers. The tow bar there represents the grid, and the one thing they have to have in common is that they have to run at the same speed. So when Fraser was talking about stability, imagine that beam has to be vertical, or in this case, in this direction all the time. Think of the speed at the whole thing at the speed that it's moving. That's frequency. So as long as the beam is in that position, the grid's stable. But not everything's ideal. So sometimes you're going to get failures, and the failures let's say a trailer blows a tire. What's going to happen, it's going to start dragging, and it's going to try to pull the grid to a lower speed on that region, on that end of the beam. What needs to happen then is some generators have to pull harder just to keep that beam in the right position. The additional load can be a fault, like the example that I have in this case, or there might be additional load. There might be new trailers just connecting while we're running. And also, you might have heard the term contingency around electrical networks. Think of contingencies as trailers that are running about the same speed, but they're not connected to the grid yet. They're just loaded. But if something happens, they can just slide in and connect to the grid. So those are generators that are kept under contingency. IEMO, for example, has a certain criteria to have a certain number of tractors always connected to the grid, and some other just rotating, just ready to connect if necessary, depending on how many load or how many trailers, how much load we have on the day. The protection mechanisms that Fraser mentioned have the function of figuring out if one of those trailers has been dragging for too long, and then pull the pin on the connection and let the load behind. The principle is you try to isolate the smaller portion where the fault is without affecting surrounding areas of the network. Again, all with the objective of keeping that frequency going at the same time. In synchronism. But what happens if we can't disconnect for whatever reason, or the tractors don't have enough power to pull at the right speed? That side of the network is going to go a bit slower, and the beam's going to slant like that. What happens then? Some others try to pull again, and that beam start going the other way. And then we're going to have to compensate again. The beam rocking back and forth, that's the oscillations of the system. When we see frequency that it's stable, the beam is vertical. When we see oscillations, the beam is fluctuating between falling behind to the load or pushing ahead a little bit and going back and forth. There's mechanisms in the network, like Fraser mentioned, to accelerate a little bit, to reduce the speed or whatever, oscillate a little bit, and then go back to stability. That's okay, that happens. In Spain, actually, there was a report that's fresh off the press last week. On the 11th, there was another set of oscillations, very, very similar to the ones that preceded the blackout. So before the blackout, they had this condition, and before the day of the blackout, these oscillations had been happening regularly for the weeks prior to the incident. So what happens when one of the trailers has to push or pull too hard, they have their own protection mechanism. If they can't sustain the pull of the load, they're going to disconnect themselves. So rather than disconnecting the load, we disconnect the generator. That saves the generator, but it makes the grid weaker on that spot. What that means is then that load is going to have to be shared by the remaining generators on the system and try to compensate and bring back stability. If that doesn't happen, there's a cascading effect. And when all the tractors have disconnected from the grid, that's when the blackouts occur. That's what happened in Spain. Eventually, all the generators disconnected from the network, and that's when voltage goes down, the speed goes to zero, the frequency falls. The way to think of renewables, I don't know if this is a good comparison, it's different kinds of generators, smaller generators that we group to look like a large generator. I don't know if you heard the term VPP, virtual power plant. A virtual power plant, imagine like it's a bunch of motorcycles that we kind of somehow hook together to make them look like a tractor. But they don't have exactly the same behavior, the same mechanical inertia that you have on the big tractors. So you would have heard all these terms kind of thrown around. I'm hoping I can give you an intuition of what all that means in the context of the network. So with that in mind, what happened in Spain then? It happened on 28th of April. pretty much at noon. Before the incident started, the voltages were a little bit high on the network already. Like Fraser mentioned, there are contingencies in terms of a kind of power called reactive power that has to be ready to dispatch to compensate for those voltages and bring everything back into control. How this happens is every network planner or a market operator would analyze all the conditions, all the forecasts, all the predictions that we have about how the network is going to behave, both in terms of load, both in terms of generation available, the conditions of the day, etc. And then they procure a certain amount of contingency, a certain amount of reserve to cope with these things. One of the things that happened in Spain, we'll reach to the conclusions, but the planning wasn't quite right. There wasn't enough for them to compensate what was going on the day. Then there's an event where you can think of either a load increase or drop in generation. It gets a little bit fuzzy when you read the reports because there's not very open acknowledgement of exactly what occurred. And many reasons will be blamed, and we didn't have the data, or certain operator is not obliged to disclose certain information. But the point is, there was, at the start of the incident, there were 1 or 2 large solar farms that disconnected from the network. One of the reports goes as far as mentioning that it might have been because the price wasn't right on the day, so they just pulled out of the market. But what happened is, imagine one of the trailers disconnects, right? So then the others have to start to compensate. That side might start dragging behind a little bit, and the oscillation started happening. Then they had a bunch of transformer trips. So on the side that Fraser mentioned, where you have those transformers on the end of on the lines, on the transmission side, a couple of them tripped, and further that drops the load, and further increases that oscillatory problem. That turned then into these voltage oscillations, or more than oscillations, what was happening with the voltage as the event happened, the voltage kept climbing. And that voltage going up is one of the main criteria that the generators use to disconnect. There's a point in which they say, I can't cope with this much voltage, and I'm going to come off the grid. Another aspect of the Spain's network is the word that is used in the industry is meshed with other networks, or is connected to other networks. In WA, I'll show you a slide, but we operate in what you would call an island, right? Fraser showed us on the slide. Spain is not an island. Spain is connected to a very large system, which is pretty much the whole continental Europe. And there's transmission lines going back and forth, and DC connections between countries and things like that. So at the time of the event, Spain was connected to Portugal and also connected to France. That has benefits and that has downsides, but part of the benefit is imagine that the beam, you have your own beam and you hook it up with other beams and make the whole thing more resilient, more robust to failures. But also the coordination of all those tractors takes a little bit of effort, and the systems have to be set up in a very particular way. What happened in the end is the end of the lines on France. France ended up disconnecting themselves because they were getting dragged down towards the end of the incident. The chart that you see there, just diving, that is the frequency. You want to see it kind of, where it's about, in our case, and also Spain, I think 50 hertz. But when it drops, that's when the blackout occurred. That means everything is disconnected from the network. At the time, just on the bottom, at the time of the incident, Spain had a load of roughly 27 gigawatts. Portugal around 6, and France on their end, on their part of the connection, lost about 7 megawatts, which is, for them, it was really insignificant. To give you a sense of proportion, on a peak day in WA, the system goes up to 4.5 gigawatts. So that's about a bit smaller than the Portugal system. So what came after, obviously, in my opinion, there was a bit of finger pointing, as you would expect. Two main reports came out. One was from the government of Spain, and the other one is from the European Union. The more recent one is the European Union, and that one doesn't quite reach a conclusion or a final root cause. They mentioned we're still researching, and there's more data to analyze and collect and things like that. The government of Spain issued a report fairly quickly, and they did land on a couple of reasons and recommendations. And what they mentioned on the report primarily is high voltages were a contributing factor. They do mention that the generation did not behave as per the rules. So when they analyze how each trailer was accelerating and deaccelerating and moving around that frequency and trying to compensate, they say they did not behave as per the rules that they had with each other. In this Spanish case, there's a bunch of different operators of individual power production networks and things like that. So the mechanism to agree, other than at the technical level being physically connected and the protections coordinated and things like that, there's also just commercial agreements on how things are supposed to respond in situations like this. So one of the reasons was, hey, you didn't do what the contract said. The other one that was very clear, which potentially you could kind of pinpoint as the final, was the expression, straw that broke the camel's back, is the reactive power. They didn't have enough reactive power on the network to compensate for that voltage increase, and they ended up having to disconnect the generators. Voltage was just climbing well beyond what it was safe limits and supposed to be, which meant they were not able to compensate for oscillations. And also what you do on the network, when I mentioned topology, is one of the techniques, if you have no other recourse, you change the way the network itself is connected. So imagine like grabbing your beam, but the beam has connections in itself, so you try to split it up maybe in a couple halves or thirds and try to run them independently so they don't drag each other. So there were a bunch of switching operations that were done on the day, but that was also insufficient. And then also finally there was this aspect of, hey, there were generators that disconnected that we were not expecting to disconnect. The report, I didn't put it in English there because it sounds a bit funny, but in Spanish they call it a multifactorial root cause. So meaning a little bit of everything happened. It is really hard to say this one thing caused the whole collapse. There are certainly contributing factors. These would be the major causes. But unfortunately, it's just often the case. There's not a silver bullet. There's not something you could say, aha, if we put effort and money on this one thing, everything's okay now. That thing doesn't exist, that one thing. Now, just to bring it in context to our network, as I mentioned, Spain, very meshed with a couple of other countries. WA, we're essentially an island. And also, one of the things that I would like to stress to you is we often don't realize or don't appreciate the uniqueness of Western Australia. Western Australia is a huge place geographically. It's very, very big. And the network, in terms of amount of power that moves around, is not that big in global terms. It's a smallish, medium-sized network. So what that means is we have to service a very vast geographical area with a network that tends to be in certain spots a bit weak. It's just the way it is. There's some stats in there for you to have a look. Just like to point out, these are renewables. I wanted to compare apples to apples. So the renewables, those are in the transmission side. That means large generation. We have to add to that all the solar panels in your roofs. the SWIS, the Western Australian, the Southwest Interconnected System has about 1.1 million connections. So there's 1.1 million customers, right, in the network. There's about 450, maybe going to 500,000 that have what we call distributed energy resources. That means you have either a panel or a battery or a combination of both. So you add that to this, and there's a lot of renewables in WA. It's probably unique in the world in the amount of penetration that we have. So back to the analogy, you have a lot of motorcycles already connected to the network, and sometimes the motorcycles are running the whole thing, right? You have a few of them, a few of the larger tractors still connected, but it's really motorcycles pulling the whole load. The issue with them is, if something starts happening, they just start flying off the steel beam. So you do need to have those contingencies to bring stability back into the network. That's what I mentioned. That's the amount of growth or the rate of growth that we had in renewables in the distribution or on the distribution side. So yeah, getting close to 500,000 connections. So back to our original questions. Can we run the WA grid with that? I became a consultant three years ago, so it depends. In reality, we have to ask questions about the context. So can they run the WA grid? Well, yes. I mean, we've seen days when they actually do it. I guess the question is, when exactly is that going to happen, for how long, how much reserve capacity or storage we need on the system, and more importantly, at what cost? Not often we talk about the cost and who's going to pay for making this transition. The book value of the SWIS, I'm sure, Elizabeth, you can fact check me. You're much more thorough than I am. But let's say it's around the current depreciated value. It's around $13–14 billion of the network. However, that wouldn't be the cost of replacing the whole thing from scratch. It's probably, I don't know, say 3 times more, right? So we're talking about $50 billion worth of an asset that somehow we want to slowly morph and decommission to bring in a brand new kind of asset. So that is the transition, and it's not going to be free, that's for sure. You've probably seen this kind of comparison between systems before, but we do have to think differently, particularly from the technical side, in terms of all these protection systems that we put together in the past 100 years. Well, guess what? They don't necessarily apply in the same way or with the same characteristics to the things on the right. They behave very, very differently. And while we transition into something like is on the right fully, we have something in between. It's a mix. We cannot apply old school thinking, but we cannot apply new school thinking fully. It's a mix somewhere in between, and that's the tricky bit for any engineer working on this. The challenge for renewables, you would have heard the word orchestration. That means getting all those motorcycles to line up, work in unison, behave the same. And they have to be connected to a grid that has already a bunch of the larger systems. So that in itself, it's a technical challenge. So when you hear the word orchestration, it's nothing more than just coordinating all the resources that are in the network to behave in a particular way, in the way that we want them to. The challenges are many. I'm sure we'll talk more about it on the panel discussion, but it ranges from the pure technical challenges through to regulatory and economic issues that we have to figure out. I would say, or I would advocate that there's probably about 3 core pillars that we have to focus on moving forward. Definitely network planning and operation in terms of the technical foundations of how we do things. That has to be very strong. And I will say this once and one only, not let it be swayed too much by political persuasion. There's elements of political change, that's okay, but we need to think about what is required by physics. And then how do we coordinate all the actors that play in that market? because the rules also have to be clear. And part of what we saw in Spain is the rules were not exactly clear, and if you give someone, a bit of wiggle room, they will take it, and it might have unexpected results. And the last one is collaboration. There's certainly not one entity that's going to be the hero, one person, one party, one institution. It's really an effort of the entire system. It has to be a holistic approach, including the consumers. Whether we like it or not, we're on this boat. We're all connected to the beam. So in closing, those are the three elements that I would say have the most, we should have the most focus on: good engineering, a good regulatory framework, and really thinking about the industry-wide participation. Hopefully that's what takes us to net zero. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Excellent. Some great visual metaphors there for what's going on, which is fantastic. To an aforementioned mechanical engineer, thank you so much. I think the idea of a whole bunch of motorcycles running the grid is frankly quite terrifying. I now share that worry. It makes me think of crossing a street in India or something. It's just stuff running everywhere and trying to somehow make that stable. And I think the correct translation of your multifactorial, I think would probably be omnishambles, I think is the word of the year in the UK a few years back. Look, now we'll jump to the panel. So first up, I guess I'll get Carlos and Fraser to take their seats, and then I'll introduce the two additional panelists. So first up, we've got Liz Aitken, who's Principal of Empire Carbon and Energy, seasoned energy and carbon specialist with over 25 years experience helping industrial and mining clients transition to lower cost, lower carbon energy through renewable power and strategic carbon markets, and navigating complex Australian energy and carbon regulation, and also never one to hold back. So, so thanks, Liz.
My reputation precedes me.
And last of all, we've got Stephen de Clerk, who's the COO, Chief Operating Officer at Colgar Renewables, where he's responsible for the operation and maintenance of a 222 megawatt Colgar wind farm, which, as well as delivery of Colgar's new renewable energy projects. In a previous life, Stephen was engineering manager on the Marinus Link and responsible for interconnecting Belgium and Germany with a high voltage DC network. So fantastic you're here. Join the table.
Thank you.
Okay, the meeting number is 417-4044. All right. Okay. Look, I'll just kick off with one now. So we've seen a fair bit of misinformation thrive recently. So if we're talking about how the actual renewable grid gets established, we talk about it's not just technical challenges, but there's sort of community challenges. And there was a recent survey that spoke and said that 2/3 of the regional communities were pretty happy with renewable energy, and they saw the benefits for farmland and backup sources of income and so forth. But then when we asked what people thought their neighbours thought, they thought only 40% of their neighbours supported it. The big difference between 2/3 and 40%. So I guess speaking to Liz, what would and then to Stephen, what are your thoughts about how you actually create a renewable run grid when there's such a disconnect between the community?
Goodness me, what a question. That's loaded. You can go first.
Yeah, I'll go.
Oh, okay, see, there you go.
Can everyone hear me? No? Is that loud enough? No.
Maybe closer to your mouth.
And this?
Yeah,
okay, cool. Another engineer struggling. So I think it's really important to share the benefits with the community. So, for example, what we're trying to do at Meriden is that we've got a community fund that's set up with a board of both Colgar employees as well as local government. And so everyone who has a project or something that can benefit the community can present that to the fund, and that's a way to get money back into the community. Because it's exactly what you say, Wilf. Everyone's happy to get a turbine on their land and get paid for that, but if there's a turbine next door and they've got to look at it but don't get paid for it, it's a lot less attractive. So that's generally the challenge we're facing.
We've got those beautiful turbines.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah, so that's
Very good. All right, thanks, Steve. Liz, any thoughts?
Sure. So I'd take it a step further because, let's be the provocateur in the room. I would actually argue, so a large proportion of the regional communities that are being looked to host wind turbines or solar farms and to, endure large transmission builds across their land, most of them actually have very, very poor reliability from the grid, really bad. So I would actually argue that the answer is even deeper than having a fund where you get to sponsor the footy club or build new changing rooms. I would actually say that you need to encourage and facilitate the construction of a microgrid for that town that would then enable them to essentially improve the reliability of their energy capability within their immediate footprint, because what that then means is that the neighbours can't complain if the wind turbines are on somebody else's property because they have received a benefit, and that benefit has come in the form of less blackouts and better opportunities from an energy perspective.
Very good. Now this is an interesting question, so probably for you, Carlos. With the Spain issue, and I was thinking the same thing when you were talking, you talked about generators not behaving the way they were supposed to behave. Now, was that a technical behaviour, as in the equipment had never been pushed to the limits at that point and therefore didn't respond the way it was supposed to, according to the rules? Or was there a commercial opportunity to be had from incorrectly incentivised generators?
No, thank you. It was mostly technical, yeah. So the way they didn't behave the way they expected is they didn't absorb enough reactives. This concept of reactives, which is probably for another analogy with beer, but each generator has a certain obligation to contribute so many of these things when the voltage is going up or down. They didn't get as much contribution as they expected, as they had in the plan for the day, meaning that there was a bit of a shortfall, it didn't compensate, voltage kept going up, and they tried to get it from some other facilities by doing these reconnections and reconfigurations, but they didn't behave quite the way they were supposed to. So there was a mismatch between the planned version of things versus what actually happened on the day. It was more technical than commercial. The one that you could attribute to commercial issues is probably those first few disconnections that didn't seemingly have a problem, and they just came off, basically, a large solar farm.
Okay, thanks. Kind of a little bit related to that, it's a question here about what's the latest capability of a lot of the grid-forming inverters? And I'd be interested in Stephen's perspective, because obviously the primary asset he's looking after versus the new ones he's developing, the existing asset would be dated from 20, I'm not sure, 20-ish? So I wouldn't maybe be benefiting from that. But are you able to talk to us a little bit about the current capability of the technology and how it performs better or differently?
Yeah, how much time do you have?
Not long.
I think what I'd like to say, this is all still very new. So in WA, for example, there might be some smaller batteries who have it, but there's no grid scale, grid forming inverters that have run through the Western Power process yet. And Australia-wide, I think the first one was maybe 5 or 6 years ago in South Australia after the blackout. But yeah, it's all still very new, and yeah, Colgar's proposing that for the new projects because we are in part of the network where we're halfway through to Kalgoorlie, which is quite weak, where we need those grid-forming inverters. The challenge is to jump through the hoops with Western Power and get them approved and complied with the standards. And the standards aren't up to date yet either. So there's a working group going on with Western Power at the moment, which is defining what that actually means and what actually does complying mean. So there's quite a lot of work going on to make that happen.
Maybe a question for Liz and Fraser in your dealings with some of the energy bureaucracy. What level of comfort do you think that, and maybe just a level of comfort comes from awareness. So what awareness do you feel the energy bureaucracy has in this new technology's ability to solve these problems and provide reliable power in the face of there not being a coal-fired power station sometime soon?
It's an interesting question. I think organisations as a whole, and the larger they are, they tend to trying to resist change in order to be stable. And that's what you actually need from an organisation. It's very actually, you don't want organisations to be too reactive. And organisations, if they're going through a major transition, historically what people do is assign a transition authority. So organisations are very good at managing steady state. They're not, you can't really expect an organisation to manage a complex operation and undertake a major transition. So that's why, rather than, berating those organisations, it's more to say they're probably not actually adequately resourced to manage the transition, and you'd probably better to allocate a transition team that had a dedicated purpose as a project, with a start, a middle, and an end to actually do it. So it's a very difficult ask, and I think what we've got will end up taking a lot longer and be a lot harder and a lot more frustrating for people. And I know, Liz, you've got a lot of personal experience on that resistance, but that's kind of my take about that. So yeah, Liz, do you probably want to add something a bit more direct about that?
Tell us about your frustrations, Liz.
That was very generous of you. We'll see. Look, so I have been through multiple iterations of policy, regulatory and management change within the energy industry, both on the East Coast and here, and it is very circular with very little forward propulsion, shall we say, in terms of managing change. I have to say that I've been very disappointed with 2025 as a year of progress for the energy industry in Western Australia. The 5 years that we spent supposedly with our Energy Transition Authority changing the rules is all now starting to be undone, and we're going backwards through, whether it be through design or, I've got to be very careful what I say here, mismanagement by people who don't really know better is probably the best way to describe that.
If that's the
Come and
current
talk to me
version.
afterwards and I'll give you the unedited version of that. So, look, I mean, even just as a basic example, if we were to have wanted to avoid a situation like the Iberian Peninsula Blackout that happened, right, what we actually need to be doing is signalling system strength in different parts of our network and encouraging the right generation. So whether that be synchrons or wind or grid forming batteries to actually locate in those areas. We have the ability to do that. What we don't have is the will, and we don't have the regulatory constructs that enable that to occur. So I am, I must say, extremely concerned with the pace of change that's occurring at the moment, and to be honest, what can only be described as a level of inertia that I haven't seen in quite a while within our reform process. So it is a worry that we're not going to be able to move through and manage the potential risks of a high renewable future because the regulatory and policy settings won't enable us to do that.
That's a related question to Carlos. Is from here, I guess an obvious conclusion from your mention of a potential second event was some reports have been written. Do you know if any concrete action has been taken to prevent a further scenario like that once the oscillations start appearing again?
Not in Spain, no. I think they're still in digestion mode and waiting for other reports, and then...
Could you hold the mic a bit closer?
Sorry.
Yes.
And then processes get in the way, and change doesn't happen quickly. So there might be some good pointers around the technical components of the potential solution, but to actually do it, there's a lot of consultation and budgets to figure out and things like that, and canvass popular opinion, things like that. So no, short answer is I don't think they've literally implemented. Maybe they change. I haven't seen anything around changing settings or changing the way they're controlling certain things or the fine-tuning some protection parameters in certain regions. They might have done that. That's an easy win, but not as a holistic solution. Again, the proof of the pudding was that they had oscillations again last week. And apparently some of those swings were a little bit higher than the one preceding the blackout. So in every electrical network, that is not just Spain or our network, you put it in a very nice way, that balance, it's that fulcrum there, the edge is very fine. It's very easy to move to one side or the other. So at all times, it's just a balancing act. Sorry for blabbing about that, but they haven't quite addressed it fully. And maybe just to I love what Elizabeth said. The other thing that I would put in your minds from the engineering perspective, when the engineering teams make decisions about decommission or recommission or buy new assets and things like that, these traditional assets, their lifespans are in decades. So you make a decision to buy something that it's worth $10 million, that it's supposed to be there for 50 years. And if I can put it back to the analogy, imagine that beam. Well, it's not all shiny and new. That beam has some parts that are quite corroded. They've been sitting there for a while. So the when we do things, it's a very important factor. And again, not economic or regulatory point of view, but from the engineering point of view, if that's where we want to go, the sooner we make those calls and those decisions, the better. Having assets sitting there at the end of the life that we don't know when are we going to decommission is probably not the best idea.
I guess your point there is it's not going to get easier if we wait longer.
No, not at all.
It's going to get harder if we wait longer.
It's going to get harder.
And that's why it's getting harder now.
Yep. Yeah. And then unfortunately the corrosion you can maybe paint over a little bit, but it's still underneath. So if you don't scratch the surface and address the problem, the thing is going to fix itself. It's going to break off from the thing. So yeah.
Thanks for those inspiring words. Just getting more and more terrified the more I speak to you. This is, I think I need a good consultant now. There's a couple of, so thanks for all the questions. Obviously everyone got the number down, so that's really good. There's a question, very optimistic question, just to counter the terrifying nature of everything Carlos is telling us right now. Could WA's grid become an advantage given its isolation, for innovation, for creating new solutions, for out-of-the-box thinking, all that kind of stuff? Who wants to?
Yes.
Stephen.
Short answer is yes.
Fraser, you jump into that.
Yeah, I think we've got a good example in Horizon Power, because Horizon Power typically will be servicing a much smaller customer base. So I know, Liz, you have to bear with me with this one, but they do have the opportunity to be innovative because they can apply innovation, and if it fails, then the consequences are obviously of a less nature. You're servicing a small town if you have a failure, and generally it's easy to contain. So I would say we have. There's definitely an opportunity to apply innovation under the right circumstances, and Horizon Power is a way of doing that, and building confidence in the engineers and the politicians that what you're proposing is actually a good idea. Because from a political perspective, when politicians are looking at something, they want to be assured it's actually a good idea, right? And they are going to get support, and they're not going to be attacked by the opposition. And the opposition is not the Liberals, by the way. The opposition's, the Minerals Council, the oil and gas industry, and Kerry Stokes over the West. So you've got to be on pretty solid ground. So the government has to be assured of that. And I think Horizon Power is a means of doing that. So Carlos, I think you've probably got closer insights into that innovation.
Thank you. Yes, the short answer is yes. There's a lot of innovation that can be done and is being done. I didn't mean to sound too doomy and gloomy. There's a lot of good things happening, and out of necessity. Obviously, we don't see many of them. They just happen inside all these teams, all these organizations. But like Fraser mentions, there are certain situations that just demand innovation, or you can't get the objective achieved. WA is, if you think about the case of the distribution side, we are literally cutting edge in the technology being put together to coordinate those 500,000 motorcycles. There's a lot of technology being developed at the moment, and WA is very much leading the country. There's no other network even in the NEM that has our conditions, our size, our penetration, all that sort of stuff. So there's a lot of room for innovation. There's a lot of room for young engineers to come and learn and put their ideas to test. Yeah.
Can I pass to Stephen for some more optimism as well there? Yeah, I'm just going to go right past Liz.
I was sitting there. I think I fully agree with everything that's being said. But we also shouldn't be afraid to look at what's happening elsewhere. Like Tasmania has been running on 100% renewables. South Australia has been running on 100% renewables at times, right? And so we can learn a lot from that as well. And I've become a proud Western Australian myself, disliking the rest of Australia. But I think it's not rocket science either. And I think what Liz said earlier, I was so happy that you mentioned minimum system strength and defining that at nodes. It's not rocket science. So putting sync-ons, making sure the grid is strong enough to allow more renewables to come in is the solution. Or part of the solution, and I think everyone knows that it's just not happening in WA, and so we should all just be louder and hopefully get the heavy beasts that are Western Power and government to move. So I think that's the job that we have at our hands.
Yeah, that's right. For sure. Talking about motorcycles. There's a question here around VPP uptake and the fact that virtual power plants, which is really just code for coordinating a whole bunch of solar and batteries to act a bit more like a big truck and less like a bunch of motorcycles. The uptake in WA has traditionally not been that high. Obviously on the East Coast, on the NEM, it has been quite high, but that's usually been driven by competitive retail. So you can buy your electricity from a whole bunch of different people. They tend to have special deals, special offers. You get $1,000 off if you join a VPP and so it's a sort of a different commercial environment, I guess, than here. So you strip all that away in WA, there hasn't been too much of an incentive. What do we think that's going to change over time? Do we think VPPs and coordinated distributed energy is showing signs of an uptick? Maybe Fraser, I'll get you to chip in initially.
I'd just say, be careful what you wish for. You have retail innovation, which is great, and I'm all for retail innovation, but you should be aware that energy prices in WA are regulated. So our prices are, I wouldn't say artificially low, but they are. There you go. Liz said it. They're artificially low. So, I guess you have to be careful what you wish for. But I think VPPs. I think it's all about sharing benefits and building trust, and I think that doesn't happen overnight. But I think there's some foundations that need to happen to build that trust, and I think it's a little bit unusual because I think in WA people will have sort of sat within their organisations and decided within the organisation what's going to happen to people, and then they've gone out and done it, rather than seeing it as being part of a democratisation of energy where there's a much larger community involvement and therefore they need to be engaged in the conversation and the journey. So it's a change for people, and it, well, from what I can see, it's not really happening, but I'm sure it will over time. But I'm not sure anything else to say about VPPs, or yeah, Liz.
Yeah. So look, in theory, all right. So just on the battery thing, the Synergy enforced VPP that you had to go into really didn't provide any benefits for the for what they wanted. So what's actually happened is the majority of people who have taken up batteries here in WA haven't taken up the state option. They've only taken up the federal funding option because the contingencies are just too high. All right, so you know, there's a lot to do with the state government not having thought through what people are actually, what they want and what they want to use batteries for. More generally speaking, however, the opportunity to do VPP would be ideal, and I'll come back to microgrids in country towns, where you might have the opportunity to actually share power appropriately around a more isolated microgrid. Unfortunately, of course, regulation gets in the way, and we can't do that here in Western Australia, whereas you can. I suggest that you go and look up Yakandanda as an amazing example of how a community microgrid could work really well. That was done in Victoria probably about 10 years ago now. We cannot replicate that here in Western Australia due to the regulatory constructs that currently exist. I have looked into it for multiple towns and it's never going to work. Right, we need wholesale change at the policy and regulation level. But more generally speaking, there is a place for VPPs. I'm just not sure that the way that it's being set up, and particularly also the new changes that are coming through pushed forward by AEMO and EPWA, are actually going to make it financially viable for private VPPs to actually participate, because they're enforcing a whole bunch of things like, if you want to make a VPP, you have to register a separate facility at every TNI to which it's applicable, which actually is going to make the costs incredibly prohibitive for anybody to participate except for Synergy. So it is becoming a bit of a closed shop already, and we haven't even got it up and running at this point in time, which is, again, how regulation ruins good things. Right. And I will just comment very quickly, because I know we're starting to run out of time, but as the only non-engineer sitting on the panel, I will say that whilst Horizon Power does have great opportunities to test things, what Horizon Power can't do, and where we are failing, is the scaling from, let's say, for example, the vanadium battery, right, which has been run very successfully at Kununurra, and vanadium batteries have been run successfully in multiple places around the world. But actually moving that vanadium battery out of the Kununurra example, which is a very small load, and into Kalgoorlie, right, is going to take apparently 5 more years, right? And it's been running up at Kununurra for a couple of years now already. So, you know, yes, there is some opportunity, but there's a big hole that exists in the middle between that testing in Horizon Power networks and actually making it work for a slightly larger grid, right? And so we just need to bear that in mind. That's where we fall over in Western Australia every time.
The urgency, that's right. No, it's a very important point. The urgency and the timing, I think, is key to all of this. There's a bunch of different ways to hurry that up. I suspect, given the current coal supply situation, that may be the thing that gives people a little bit of inspiration at the moment, because that's something that can't really be debated. You either have enough coal or you don't, or it's economic or it's not economic. Neither of those things are happening. Now I'm just going to sneak one last question in, and just on a larger scale thing, we'll spend a bit of time on the smaller scale stuff. So there's a question here about the Western Power Network Opportunities Map, and whether that should be done in a better way, and that's really to maybe you want to start by explaining what that is to people. I'll let you
want me to
jump
do
in.
it? Sure. So every year, under the market rules, Western Power is required to produce a transmission system plan document, and with that, an associated network opportunities map. Okay. Now, the point of both of these documents is that it's meant to provide pointers to generation as to where they're going to be, or where they're going to be best located, based around a whole bunch of different parameters. Now, this year, there was no, well, in fact, I was actually looking at it today. Neither of those documents met the requirements of the rules as was set out for 2025. To be frank, they've been very substandard. And this year's doesn't actually tell you anything at all. And there is no 2025 network opportunities map at this point.
So as a developer, Stephen, how does that sort of factor into your thinking, commercial opportunities, etc.?
Oh, not my favourite topic. No, so I again echo what Liz says. So it is really challenging to develop in WA, because a plan like that should be leading the way. Whereas, for example, we're trying to put more wind between Merredin and Kalgoorlie, which from a diversification point of view is very much needed because everything's in Geraldton at the moment. We've been lobbying or trying to lobby for a while for that. And there's many others lobbying in other areas. And so the transmission plan or cell east, as they call it, goes from Yuja all the way to Narrogin, and then that's it. So I don't know, I don't want to call that east. But having said that as well, there's a lot of wind in that area as well, which now can connect. So it's really the challenge that we are at Colgar are facing is that is you want to talk to Western Power, but you also want to talk to government, and in the end you need to talk to the minister to make those things happen, and that's a shame because she's got a lot on her plate, and surely that can happen in a more efficient way.
That's right.
Yeah.
And it's not just you.
No, I know.
Right. So you are not alone. The interesting thing as well is that there has just been a new consultation request opened up by EPWA, which is for the formalisation of $100,000 a megawatt for for anything that's connecting load or generation to the network above 10 megawatts. Now, I know that that's probably a meaningless bunch of things to say, but this is not for the connection. This is for deep connection. So basically you're paying it to Western Power just for stuff somewhere down the line, right? Now, the other thing to bear in mind is that what Western Power are also trying to do is the transmission plan is deliberately light on in terms of the maps and the actual points of where the transmission network is meant to be expanding, because the longer the connection part, the part that the actual generator has to pay for, right, to run to a transformer, that means that there's less that Western Power has to pay for, right, and then get an extra $100,000 a megawatt for all of these connections to bolster the network that's already in place. Okay, so there is a bit of and I don't know how politically correct this is, but there's a bit of creeping Sharia going on here in relation to how the network is actually being funded and how it is being built out, and who actually has responsibility for what at the transmission level. And it is quite concerning. Could we say that the state government is not meeting its requirements as the monopoly provider of transmission assets in the state? It's possible you could draw that conclusion. It's also possible that there's insufficient funds available in Western Australia's budget to be able to build a lot of these transmission assets as well. We don't know, and there's no clarity from any of the data sets that we supposedly should be receiving to establish that.
I think it's a really good sort of final point, I think, on where we find ourselves. And what I'd love to do is to get, as we proceed through planning for next year, there's a lot of questions in what we need to get to where we need to get to. And anything that we can do to hold forums that shine a light on various issues and get things out for discussion is a good thing. So anyone here or anyone in the audience that has suggestions for next year, please get in touch, and we will hold plenty of more sessions to come. In the meantime, I would like to thank our panellists for their time. So thanks for turning up to probably our most technical session that we've had all year. Hopefully you've all learned something and come along with a good understanding. Just a couple of calls to action at the end. Please stay informed. One of the things you can definitely do to stay informed is to sign up to the fantastic newsletter Boiling Cold by Ben and Milne, and join a group, join us, come along, help out. And have a chat with your local, state and federal MPs when you get an opportunity. Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.